Owing to the disruptive effects of the pandemic, 5.4 million people are now on out-of-work benefits, even though a labour shortage is the excuse for mass migration. Apparently, the department does have plans in place to get Britain back to work in 18 months' time. State of the Nation starts now. I'll also be joined by a disputatious panel this evening, Britain's favourite socialist and transcaucasia expert, the former Labour MP Stephen Pound, and the ever-pugnacious former editor of The Sun, Kelvin Mackenzie. As always, I want to hear from you. It's a crucial part of the programme. Email me, mailmog@gbnews.com. But now it's time for the news of the day with Aaron Armstrong.
Very good evening to Aaron Armstrong here in the GB newsroom. A manhunt is underway after a former soldier charged with terror offences escaped from Wandsworth Prison. Our Home and Security editor Mark White has more.
As authorities try to determine how Daniel Khalif managed to escape from Wandsworth Jail, there is now a nationwide manhunt. At ports and airports right around the country, there are additional security personnel and long queues as they check everyone leaving the country. GB News understands that Khalif escaped by clinging to the underside of a delivery truck leaving Wandsworth Prison. Prison authorities, we understand, were alerted within minutes of his disappearance.
Well, questions remain about why Khalif was being held in a Category B prison rather than a high-security facility. The Shadow Justice Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, says the government has lost control of the justice system.
I think the government has very serious questions to answer. We know that the criminal justice system, after 13 years of Tory government, is in a state of disrepair. We know that there are huge problems with prisons and prison places in particular. And as we've seen, there is now a terror suspect on the loose, having escaped from Wandsworth Prison. So big questions for the government to answer. Frankly, Rishi Sunak needs to get a grip.
Meanwhile, the Prime Minister's defended how the government has handled the problem of crumbling concrete in schools. Thousands of pupils at 19 schools in England have been forced to stay at home as the new term gets underway. At Prime Minister's questions, Sir Keir Starmer likened the government's response to cowboy builders, saying ministers had been cutting corners and carrying out botch jobs. Rishi Sunak responded by saying the government has acted decisively in the face of new information and called Sir Keir Starmer Captain Hindsight. 17 people, including a child, have been killed and 32 injured by a Russian missile strike in the city of Kostyantynivka in the east of Ukraine. Authorities there have posted footage which shows a loud explosion ripping through a busy market. Now, the attack came just hours after the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken paid a surprise visit to Kyiv to reaffirm US support for Ukraine. And in the past half an hour or so, he has announced a new package of aid for Ukraine worth more than $1 billion. More on that a little later this evening. The UK is set to rejoin the European Union's Horizon Science Research Programme. The government negotiated membership of the £85 billion scheme in the Brexit withdrawal agreement, but it was never ratified because of disputes that emerged over the Northern Ireland Protocol. Well, reports now suggest Prime Minister Rishi Sunak will confirm a final deal this week after a 2-year absence. And many of you will have been enjoying the warm weather today. It was the hottest day since 2016, with temperatures reaching 32 degrees at Kew Gardens in London. And that good weather is set to continue all of this week. It could well reach a high on Saturday. 33 degrees has been forecast in London. That would be even warmer than it is in Ibiza, and it would be the hottest day of the year. However, an amber warning for heat has been issued by the Met Office, which is valid through until Sunday evening. Well, this is GB News on TV, on your digital radio and your smart speaker too. Just say play GB News. Now it's back to Jacob.
Enquest is a medium-sized energy production company, and owing to the government's windfall tax on energy, it has turned what would have been a considerable profit margin into a loss for the first 6 months of 2023. EnQuest is not the only one. Harbour Energy is another, the largest London-listed independent oil and gas company. It provides 15% of the UK's oil and gas production. Harbour swung from nearly £1 billion of profits for the first half of this year to an £8 million loss, again because of the windfall tax. Indeed, Harbour, and this is really important, has said it will refuse to drill new oil wells because of the tax. It feels forced to explore other options such as Mexico and Indonesia. Well, why does this matter? First of all, we need to maximise the use of our resources. And these small and medium-sized companies take on oil wells that the majors have decided they're no longer big enough for them. They ensure that we get that last drop of oil out. And when they face an energy windfall tax of 75%, which is likely to remain until 2028, they don't make any money, therefore they won't invest in the UK, they will invest elsewhere. And this makes the cost of living higher. First of all, ultimately, the government gets less tax revenue because less oil is being taken out. Secondly, there's less oil production, which makes prices higher, which keeps energy prices high. But it also has an effect on energy security as we're more dependent on other nations. And this tax affects the smaller and medium-sized energy companies. The tax is a flea bite for the BPs and Shells of this world, and it disincentivises, as I've said, investment at a time when we desperately need investment. We saw last year the problem that arises if you are dependent entirely on foreign sources from insecure countries. Now, I know that oil companies periodically make vast profits, but they've always, for years and years, been taxed at a higher rate than other businesses to recognise this and to recognise that the oil is something they're licensed to take out of the ground that is viewed as a national asset. But if the oil companies have higher costs, these get passed on to consumers. And that's why it's time to scrap the windfall tax. We'd get more oil, cheaper oil, more tax revenue, and a better economy. But of course, I want to hear from you. Don't forget to let me know your thoughts. You know the email by now. You've probably learned it off by heart. It's mailmog@gbnews.com. My autoprompter says .uk, but I'm pretty sure that's wrong, and it's .com. However, you probably know better than I do, as I said. I'm delighted to be joined now by Robert Palmer, the Director of Tax Justice UK. Robert, thank you so much for coming in.
Good evening.
Isn't it important that companies know the tax that they're going to pay before they invest, rather than after they've made the investments and then get clobbered in terms of tax justice?
I mean, I think in general you want a steady tax system where people understand what tax they're going to pay. But what we have at the moment with the energy sector, and particularly oil and gas, is that there's been a huge spike in the oil and gas prices globally because of the war in Ukraine. And that means a lot of these oil and gas companies have been making really significant amounts of money. And in the UK, you know, we've got a long history of windfall taxes. We had them after the First and Second World War. In fact, Margaret Thatcher introduced a windfall tax on the oil and gas.
And on banks.
And on banks in the 1980s.
Yes.
And I think what we're talking about is looking at the oil and gas sector in general. You have, overall, the sector is making really significant money and it's profiting off high oil and gas prices due to the war. And at the same time, you know, you have people across the country who are struggling to pay their very high bills.
That's absolutely true. But in the worst point of the COVID pandemic, the crude oil price was below zero, and the oil companies were making significant losses on oil that they were taking out of the ground, and you can't just stop taking things out. And therefore, of course, their tax burden fell because there were no profits to be taxed on. When the price goes up, at the normal rate of tax, they were still paying about 50% tax. Isn't that enough? And it also incentivises long-term investment.
I mean, around the world, oil and gas companies pay higher rates of tax because they are pumping out our national resource. This is our oil, our gas, and therefore I think it is, as a usual base, you would expect them to pay higher levels of tax. And I do think it is important, you know, politics is about choices, and the government desperately needs money to support public services, and asking overall a very, very highly profitable industry to pay more in tax, I think is the smart thing to do.
I don't object to the higher base level for oil companies for exactly the reason you mentioned, that it's deemed to be a national resource and it's a licence. You don't own the oil if you're the oil company, you have a licence to extract it. But the oil price immediately after Russia invaded Ukraine went well over $100 a barrel. It's now at about 90, but it's been back down into the 70s and the 80s. The extra normal profits, supernormal profits, aren't there in the way they were initially, are they?
I mean, it will depend across different companies. It can be quite hard to actually understand what's going on. I saw an oil and gas industry expert be quite critical of Harbour Energy because they were piling all their tax losses into 1 year in their press release. So I think sometimes it's a little bit difficult to work out exactly what's going on. But I think the big picture for me is, first of all, overall it's an industry that's making quite a lot of money. But secondly, you talked about wanting to extract every last drop. I mean, really what you're talking about is propping up a dying dinosaur industry. This is an industry that relies on very significant amounts of public subsidy in a way that other industries don't. Lots of public money.
What subsidy are you talking about?
So there is money. So first of all, the windfall tax has a 90% tax relief for further investment.
But that's not public money. That's simply not taxing people if they invest. That's not giving them public money. The two are completely different.
And then there is also subsidies around looking after the oil services and subsidies around decommissioning.
What subsidies? Oh, decommissioning is a tax write-off against taxes you've already paid. Because it's a cost of doing business.
It's registered.
This is not a subsidy. This is loose language because all businesses are able to offset the cost of doing business. If you take down a wind farm after its natural life, that will be offsettable as a tax deductible because it's a cost of doing the business. But that's perfectly fair and reasonable.
There is a special and especially generous regime for the North Sea oil and gas, the North Sea oil and gas industry.
But that's really a recognition of the change in regulations that made it more expensive than when the companies signed up. So you've changed the regulations retrospectively, and therefore you've given a tax write-off in favour of it. But that isn't a subsidy.
I mean, it's still a generous tax position from the government that other industries don't face. And you talked about energy.
All industries get a tax write-off on investment.
I mean,
and have done for years.
Industries do get tax write-offs, but the oil and gas industry has a particular regime which has particularly more generous things. But I think there is a wider point. We could spend a lot of time.
But this is really important because you constantly hear people saying all these subsidies go to oil and gas. They don't. They are a very, very heavily taxed, hugely net contributing to tax revenues business. And Harbour Energy, I think, is particularly interesting. I met them when I was Energy Secretary. And I thought it was a really impressive business because it's taking on assets that other people don't want and is essentially sweating them to the benefit of the UK economy. And that's an important part of the economic process. And we're now forcing them to Mexico.
I mean, I think there's also a point about, do we really want to be encouraging an industry that is potentially has stranded assets where, you talked about energy security, but most of the oil and gas that we produce here will get sold abroad and get sold at international oil and gas prices. So actually, having our own industry doesn't reduce our reliance on international oil and gas prices.
Well, but it has an effect on international prices.
A very, very small amount,
It's really important because supply and demand determines the price. And you see how OPEC and OPEC Plus tries to operate to massage the supply to change the price. If you've got independent producers outside OPEC, that actually has a disproportionate effect potentially on pricing.
But I mean, the UK is a tiny proportion of oil and gas.
All pricing is set at the margin. So if you have one barrel of oil more than people want, the price goes down. If you have one barrel of oil less, it goes up. And you saw this so clearly in 2020 when the price went into negative territory.
And I think what we saw after the invasion of Ukraine, when you had a huge spike in oil and gas, that the UK was particularly exposed to the fact that we rely on oil and gas. And if you look at what, for example, the US and China are doing, they're going gangbusters for renewal, continuing to support a dying industry that actually undermines our energy security.
But what's reduced the US's carbon emissions most? It's been fracking. It's been moving to their own gas source, which we should do because we've got trillions of cubic feet of gas under us. And that would be an enormous benefit and reduce prices because you take out all the transportation costs and so on.
I mean, I think fracking, first of all, I think is a political non-starter in this country. I just don't think there is public consent to do it. But even so, the sort of lead-in times to introduce a new fossil fuel industry that we've become reliant on, as opposed to investing in green technology, which, as I said, the two big superpowers in the world, China and the US, are investing huge amounts of green. So propping up North Sea oil and gas, with the tax regime that they have, it also undermines our energy security because it makes us more reliant.
Well, I'm so fair. I've given you the last word. But, Robert, thank you very much for coming in. And don't forget to let me know what you think. mailmog@gbnews.com. I was right. Coming up, it's the latest chapter in the concrete crisis. But whose side are you on, Gillian Keegan or the school bosses who need to get off their posteriors, backsides, as the Education Secretary suggested? Plus, how do we get Britain back to work?
This September, the GB News family is back together. From breakfast, right across the day, breaking the latest stories, and every evening. And don't forget the weekend. We've got the whole of the UK covered. Every week, we'll be hearing your views from up and down the country, with fun, lively and intelligent conversation with the biggest guests. This September, we'll meet Chris and John. Thank you for choosing GB News. We're proud to be Britain's news channel.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nana, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation, and you've been getting in touch with your views. Stephen, you continue to reference this government as Conservative. Surely even someone as loyal as you recognises this government is no longer Conservative. It's a shame that you have given up. Well, I haven't given up, and I'm definitely Conservative. Peter, sadly, the windfall tax on North Sea oil and gas is a classic socialist theory, and hell with the concept of does it work in practice. And Lewis says oil production is broken and requires root and branch reform. The extracted oil should belong to the country and not private companies. BP, Shell, etc. divert profits from our oil to low-tax countries. So, the return for school is for many a time of adaptation, adjustment and growing pains. The Education Secretary herself has arguably had one of the toughest starts to the new year, as her department has ordered the closure of multiple schools just days before the start of term. Gillian Keegan eloquently and candidly told school leaders to act with greater urgency and inform ministers whether they are affected by crumbling concrete. In the days since, the Education Secretary has been labelled desperate, outrageous and accused of shifting the blame onto individual schools. Pupils at 24 schools out of 22,000 nationwide are reportedly studying remotely, and no one yet knows how much it will cost to fix the aerated concrete crisis. There's no doubt that this issue has been neglected over years by the Education Department, but the Education Secretary has shown decisive, swift action. So isn't it now time for others to fulfil their responsibilities? Well, I have my brilliant panel, the Trans-Caucasia expert and socialist Stephen Pound and the pugnacious former editor of The Sun, Kelvin Mackenzie. Stephen, hasn't Gillian got a lot of unfair blame for this? Because the responsibility for school buildings is with the academy, sometimes with the church, sometimes with the local authority. It's not actually directly with the department at all.
No, Jacob, it's always easier to find a scapegoat than it is to find a solution. And I think at the moment, because she was at one of her homes in Marbella, and because of the rather lower deck language...
It's a £300,000 home, yeah.
Well, no, I'm not entirely sure that's the point.
Make it sound like a villa or something.
Can I just say that this business with the reinforced autoclave aerated concrete, goes back to the 1945 year. But in 20...
So that was a Labour government, wasn't it? So you're saying it was a Labour government?
No, just before 1945, actually.
The coalition.
Yeah, thank you. But look, the reality is, in 2018, we were warned by the specialist committee on this, that the breeze blocks, in effect, is what they are perfectly good for making walls. They're no good for span, and they're no good for load bearing. And the worrying thing is, building schools for the future, which is an excellent scheme, which would actually rebuild our schools, was then cut.
But it was extremely expensive, and we'd run out of money.
I'm sorry, I think it probably saved money in the long run, because look at the cost nowadays. Now, when you talk quite rightly about the small figure in the grand scheme of things, but, Jacob, the Harrow Crown Court in my part of the world has just closed. It's closed indefinitely, which may be good news for some of the criminals in northwest London, but it's proving bad news for those of us who believe in justice. And it's not just the Crown Court, it's not just the schools, it's not just the government buildings, it's throughout the country that people are faced with this problem.
But I think
I'll give Gillian Keegan credit. She's a tough woman.
And she's dealt with the problem, and she said something has to be done, and she's stopped dangerous...
We would certainly like, within your party's cabinet, for more Gillian Keegans. I mean, after all, this was a woman at 16. She leaves school and she goes on to become, a car apprentice in Liverpool. She goes on and makes something of her life, right? And she talks like the voters talk. So what would be bloody nice if I heard something like that from Rishi Sunak talking about migration or anything? Actually, one of our problems within the Conservative Party, one of the problems within the Conservative Party, is I don't recognise anything that anybody says. And the truth about the matter is, any government could have dealt with this literally since probably, well, the Times had a front page story in '95 which was pointing this out. And when I last looked, I got the impression that the Labour government were around at that time. So I honestly believe...
It was actually John Major.
John Major at the time. Sorry, they had 13 years after that. Sorry, they've had two of them up to 2013. Right, so I am very pleased with Miss Keegan, and the truth about the matter is, when Rishi goes, and certainly he's going to go unless he has some massive change in his personality, Keegan and people like Keegan will be in massive demand to be leader of the Conservative Party, and I, for one, will cheer. I am sick and tired of every time anybody sounds like anybody that I would recognise or would like to meet actually being traduced by the left.
OK, so Kelvin, you're defending her for saying what people think. Yeah. But has she, more importantly, done a good job? Has she been right to go ahead and say...
The evidence changed. This looked like serious. And the other point that you made in your opening was correct. There are 22,000, right? This isn't even a rounding error, right? Any day of the week, there would be at least 24 schools that were being shut for some kind of issue surrounding the building being unsafe. So this is not a big deal, but the trouble is it shows where the Conservative government are right now. So when a little bit of bad news comes along correctly, it turns into much bigger news.
At the moment, they're unlucky. And, you know, the one thing you can't actually account for is luck. And I'm afraid to say that the luck's run out for the Tory government. I actually feel sorry for... I think, you know, Gillian Keegan... I mean,
Hold on.
Sorry.
Socialist feels sorry for competitors.
I'm sorry, you have to have a heart of stone, you know, not to have some sympathy. And mind you, when it says Keegan, I thought it was Kevin Keegan that they were bringing in to rescue him at the last minute. So he was a football manager and a very popular football
association.
Yes. But Stephen, I think you were being harsh on Gillian a moment ago when you were saying that she was away at the end of August.
No, I say
lots of people go away at the end of August. That's not an unreasonable thing, even for a Secretary of State.
Sorry,
and you are in favour of people presumably having a home abroad, are you?
Not 4 homes. You've got one in Spain, one in France.
Well, she's a successful... Her husband is a successful person. She's a successful person. They're entitled to spend their money. They're entitled to spend their money as they will. And this is the trouble with Labour.
Look, can I just say, what I was saying is it looked terrible. And, you know, similarly, when she was using lower decks language, and I take your point, there's an authenticity about the Liverpudlian woman who left school at 16, who was an engineering apprentice, using lower decks or industrial language. Fair enough. But, you know, it just happens to be bad luck. People will remember that. You know and I know that they remember John Major's underpants long after they remember the fact that he was a damn good...
An issue that is affecting under 1% of schools, to Kelvin's point, is being reported as if it's affecting every school in the country.
The reason for this is quite clear. It's because the government is unpopular. So no matter what happens, even if it's nothing to do with anybody, suddenly it becomes a Tory issue. And I put this to Sunak because he will not be bold. I'm afraid he has been bent low by this office. I don't feel sorry for him. He'll go on to... He's enormously wealthy now. He'll go on to have an enormously successful second career. But politics and being Prime Minister will not have been one of them, to be honest.
So, Stephen, what would Labour have done differently? It had Building Schools for the Future, but that covered 13 schools out of 150 that have this problem and was enormously extravagant and expensive. Are they just jumping on a bandwagon on a relatively small number of schools about a problem that's actually been known to everybody? And as buildings get refurbished,
I sincerely hope that it's not. And I have to say, Bridget Phillipson made a very measured and very informed speech. I thought it was pretty impressive. And I thought as a future leader of one party there, you've talked about a future of the other party.
So you want to get rid of Keir Starmer?
Yeah. No, good heavens, no. He's a young man. But look, the reality is that BSF, Building Schools for the Future, was a first-class proposal that actually rebuilt every single primary school in my constituency, my former constituency. Every single one was rebuilt under BSF. You know, and the money we saved in the long term. But the real problem is when it was cut, if you remember, OK, it was only from 200 to 50, but that was a rolling programme.
OK, can I ask one other thing? All right, we'll work on the assumption for this discussion that Labour are going to get in, right? As far as I can see, our country looks skint, more skint than I can remember in my life.
Not a good election to win, believe you me.
OK,
well, there we go.
What on earth are they going to do? Are they going to rebuild every school? And if they are, please tell me what my taxes are going to look like at the end of all this.
Well, your taxes are likely to go up if that would happen. Thank you to my panel. Coming up, has shoplifting been relegated to the ranks of cyclists, bicyclists crossing when there's a red light? Plus, has Britain become overrun with shirkers?
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello again, it's Aidan McGivern here from the Met Office with the GB News forecast. A warm, sultry night to come for many of us. More hot sunshine into Thursday. A small chance of thunderstorms developing towards western and southwestern areas in particular as low pressure sends heat and humidity northwards across the UK. Now, any thunderstorms that do develop will be very hit and miss, quite isolated, mostly towards western areas overnight. But there is the chance that these thunderstorms will contain frequent flashes of lightning, so they could be quite visible in the night sky where they do occur. Some low cloud creeping into the east. It's a warm night for many, mid to high teens, and in some places no colder than 20 or 21 Celsius. So some patchy fog about first thing Thursday, some of this misty low cloud in the east, but that will tend to retreat to North Sea coasts. And for many, it's a fine day, but we've still got that potential thundery activity moving north into Northern Ireland and parts of Scotland by the afternoon. It's a very warm or hot day in places, 29 to 32 Celsius in the south, 28 Celsius for northern Scotland. So the heat is extensive across the UK, and it's a warm start to Friday. Again, some of that misty low cloud in the east. Again, the threat of thundery showers towards the west and southwest, but otherwise it's just a case of sunny skies, and the temperatures continue to rise up to 33 Celsius in places by Saturday.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
The Live Desk with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Pip Thompson. It's here Monday to Friday on GB News.
From midday, we'll bring you the news as it breaks, whenever it's happening and wherever it's happening, from across the UK and around the world.
Refreshing, feisty, but with a bit of fun too.
If it matters to you, we'll have it covered on TV, radio and online.
Join the Live Desk on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is two new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton, for 2 hours packed full of unfiltered opinions, unique takes and fiery debates. I guarantee you blockbuster guests and exclusive reporting with no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I think there is a culture of collusion, quite frankly.
And no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. That's Mark Dolan Tonight, Friday, Saturday and Sunday from 9. Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Like all families, we have arguments every now and then, but actually we agree on what the mission of GB News is, and that's the most fundamentally important thing.
GB News provides the kind of platform that lets all voices be heard. We don't hold back. We're free to say what we really think.
Just because some people who live in a tiny little Westminster bubble think that their particular story is important, that's not the most important story for me.
And often they will be difficult stories, stories that you won't find on the establishment media.
Because what people think in the north of England may be very different to what they're thinking in their home counties.
We're going to carry on telling the world what life is really like for households up and down the UK.
We love to be in your car, in your kitchen as you're having your breakfast, whatever you're doing, you are part of the show. If it matters to you, it matters to us.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and you've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Wayne says, we should name and shame the schools that haven't submitted their questionnaires. It's a very good idea. I agree with Wayne. Derek, the concrete crisis was less to do with the government and more the responsibility of planners and builders. And Derek's absolutely spot on too. And others are involved. It comes to the government at a higher level. Ted, it's the management of the schools that's to blame for this situation, not the government. It's really interesting. So many of these are on the side of Gillian Keegan. And Geoffrey, strange Labour were in charge when they built these buildings. Well, as Stephen was telling us, in 1945. So we can blame lots of things on past Labour governments. It's one of my specialities. Few things irk the much disregarded pedestrian more than an entitled bicyclist whizzing through a red light or over a zebra crossing. But we've come to accept this crime, and it is a crime, as part of life. And while these beastly creatures are a menace to society, they don't seem to be top of the priority list when it comes to tackling crime. But are other sorts of more serious crime being relegated to this level too? Well, the chairman of Asda, Lord Rose, has suggested that shoplifting has become effectively decriminalised. And he has a point. Only 1 in 6 reports of shoplifting results in a conviction, which means hundreds of thousands of cases are going unpunished every year. And we must remember, even if you may have not personally witnessed the crime itself, supermarkets incorporate the costs incurred by shoplifting into their prices. So it has, in effect, become a silent tax for law-abiding consumers. We all have a stake in this problem being swiftly resolved. So are the police doing enough to tackle the problem? Well, with me now is Peter Blexley, the former Metropolitan Police detective. Peter, thank you for joining me. Surely shoplifting is a gateway crime, and that once people feel they can get away with that, they'll think they can get away with more serious.
It's an insidious crime, and it's not being policed or prosecuted at any kind of level that it should be. But this dates back to about 2014, really, when we had the Antisocial Behaviour Crime and Policing Bill got passed. And what that did was it said that any shoplifting offence under £200 could only be tried in the lower courts, so in the magistrates' courts. Not long after that, some bright spark of a senior police officer thought, right, we can use this as an excuse now not to get involved. And they went public with that. And essentially, through the idiocy of making that statement, created a criminal charter. And now the chickens are coming home to roost.
So this is a decision made by the police because it's in the Magistrates' Court not to prosecute. We were hoping to hear from Katie Bourne, the Sussex Police and Crime Commissioner, who's the national lead for business and retail crime, but either she doesn't want to come on and defend the position of the police or has some other reason that she cried off at the last moment. So you're saying essentially it's that type of bureaucracy that people like her are in charge of that is...
Well, first of all, she's not the first police and crime commissioner who doesn't want to involve themselves in a public debate with me. Yes, essentially... Well, so be it. Essentially, the police decriminalised it. They created a charter. Criminals are aware of these outpourings from police officers. And now, just a few years later, we have got to the completely unacceptable position where people are strolling into shops, stealing with impunity. There are certain major retailers that have non-intervention policies, which is a huge problem, and the police simply do not turn up, even when there's aggravating circumstances, like members of retail staff being assaulted, and hundreds of retail staff are being assaulted every day.
What on earth are the police doing? They go around with a van load to arrest some poor lady who was praying near an abortion clinic, and they can't stop people shoplifting. I mean, what's the point?
Well, in some regards, they've gone on some kind of woke, fluffy, liberal, ideological kind of campaign to police social media,
well, let's
which
bring
is
in
not
our
their
woke, fluffy
point.
liberal. Come on, Stephen.
Look, the real problem here is that between 2010 and 2020, we lost 20,000 police officers in England and Wales. And I don't care how good the police officers are, if you lose 20,000 police officers, and why Theresa May oversaw this as Home Secretary is absolute mystery to me. But we've now got a situation where, if you remember Bill Bratton, when he was the police commissioner in New York, he had this broken window theory. If you have a building with a broken window, then more windows will be broken. If you allow the minimum crime to actually, like, the street begging and things like that, it would go on to more. Last week, or the week before last, in Oxford Street, a whole group of kids turned up, attracted by social media, to go steaming into a shop there. And the police in London are now a riot squad. They're not the detective force that they were in your day.
It's the escalation of that shoplifting, which is what happens when there is police inactivity and there is no deterrent factor. No shoplifter imagines that he's going to turn the corner and run into a police officer, because the police do not patrol the streets these days.
But Calvin, this means we'll turn into San Francisco and the streets will become entirely lawless.
So in my local Waitrose, what happens there is that they know this person is a shoplifter. The shoplifter comes in and starts putting the alcohol into their trolley, wheels it round, and then makes a dart, instead of going to pay for it, makes a dart for the exit. They're already there. They stop him. He says, "Oh, thank you." He then walks on, leaving the drink behind, and there's no arrest. So the crime hadn't actually come to its end. This is happening every day, every single one. Tesco's are now putting body cameras on their staff. They're being assaulted.
They need
These
protected.
are violent thugs who need to be arrested. And what I can't understand is why some chief constable of Surrey, round my way, or anyway, simply says, I tell you what, we are now going after them. And go back to the, after all, we all pay a precept for this, go back to the money people and say, we need a special. I tell you what, why don't we have a shoplifting police or a cycle police? Or why don't we have some designated people doing this? I can do with the food price going down. Actually, I'd much prefer have these people banged up.
There are private
criminals.
security companies now that will patrol, detain and prosecute. They're one-stop shops for prosecuting shoplifters.
But what are the police doing instead? Because the 20,000 police that went have now been replaced.
Well, not
there are,
quite.
whatever it is, 130,000 police in this country. There must be some of them who could go to supermarkets to arrest people.
And that's a very, very apposite question because, of course, the majority mainstream of the UK have been abandoned by police in the last couple of decades. Because if you get your phone stolen, your bicycle stolen, your house broken into, your car stolen, or you're a shopkeeper and you have property stolen by way of shoplifting, you have not received a police investigation or service for the last 20 years or so. All you've got is a frankly worthless crime reference number. And that has been such a large driver in people losing trust in the police, as well as the big, awful, catastrophic, vile headline cases. But the police turning their back on the moderate mainstream and the crimes that affect them has also been a major...
Isn't it terrifying? If you go into Boots today and you wanted to buy a razor blade or a razor, they're actually fixed to the wall there. Now, the problem with this is crime fuels crime. People steal and then they sell that. They sell it down the pub. Then maybe they buy drugs with it. But the thing is, you actually created a widening pool of criminal underworld there because it starts with nicking stuff from the supermarket and it ends up with gangs of people steaming into
OK,
Oxford
I'm going to set you three an intellectual challenge. What do you think Katie Bourne would say as a police and crime commissioner if she was coming on to defend the police? What is the argument to say? Is it resources? Is it that they're so busy with other things? Is it that this is, in fact, a trivial crime? Is it that people are so poor they have to steal? Can any of you come up with the defence?
Say we're dealing with terrorism. That's what they always do. They say there are things that you don't
like
know.
the chap who's just escaped from prison.
Yes, but they'll say there's things that you don't know that you can't understand because they will always find an excuse. It's always a damn sight easier to find an excuse than to actually map a course of action.
One of the interesting things with these crime commissioners, I thought they were on our side. What has actually happened is that they have decided it's in their interest to stay in a job if they're on the side of the chief constable, so they get their direction in that.
Rather well
I imagine what she would say is, I think it's disgraceful, by the way, the fact that she didn't turn up and make this argument, whatever it is.
She's a public servant.
It's not about poor people stealing. That makes criminals of everybody, right? Will be a disgusting argument, and I hope she doesn't.
So what do you think she would say to
I think she would probably say we are having our resources stretched. There's a lot of crime out there, and I'm afraid we have to prioritise.
And a lot of
I'm beginning to sound like the Surrey Crime Commission.
A lot of motorists
You could probably do it.
Anyway, thank you to all my panel and to Peter. Coming up, the panel will be back, and they'll telling us how we get Britain back to work.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle.
Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things. We've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I continue to identify as Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your male Moggs. Daniel says, barging through gates at railway stations is rife. Sounds small, but people not paying their fare is a crime. And Ed says, it's almost legal in Britain today. If it continues like this, it'll probably be turned into a national sport in the near future. Well, we might win at the Olympics. Apparently cricket's coming back to the Olympics too. Just a few days ago, the Department for Work and Pensions released the quarterly welfare figures, and unfortunately, they paint a bleak picture. 5.4 million British people are on out-of-work benefits. And at a time of labour shortage, this is especially worrying, especially as the labour shortage is used for 606,000 people coming into this country through legal migration. In some of our biggest cities, like Glasgow or Liverpool, as many as 1 in 5 people within the working age population are on benefits, whilst the cities themselves are crying out for workers. Thousands of jobs are on offer with higher than average salaries. But this question goes right to the heart of a more fundamental question of our economy, the immigration one, the migration one. How are we allowing so much migration when there isn't a shortage of labour? There are 5.4 million people, potential workers in this country, who are there to fill the gaps, and their potential is being wasted. This is roads in needs of repair, British politics. This one leads back to the pandemic, prior to which, under Ian Duncan Smith's leadership at Work and Pensions Secretary from 2010 to 2016, Britain was really getting its welfare policies right. But the pandemic led to a change in attitudes, which still hasn't returned to normal. All the sanctions and so on were lifted. Payments just got dished out. And it emerged today the government intends to crack down on the £26 billion benefits bill, but not until after the next election. Kelvin, 5.4 million people. This is an awful lot of work available. Why isn't it happening? How do we get these people back into work?
Well, first of all, we've got to find out why they're doing this. And the answer that the reason that they're doing it, let's be honest about it, there is a massive element of malingering. It's straightforward.
But these aren't work benefits. These aren't disability benefits.
Well, yeah, but they're all part of the same thing. So you've got mental health issues. You've got all kinds of issues which COVID and the pandemic has caused us a problem. People don't look upon work as something that is important in their lives. What is important in their lives is money being delivered by the government, i.e. people all over the place, but not them, right? And they find that they can exist as subsidy junkies at that much lower level. There is no way you're going to get these people back to work until you decide to literally cut the benefits and listen to the pain.
Well, a lot of these benefits are actually benefits are paid to working people, and so that there's a problem there, which I hope...
Some of them. Some of them are.
Yeah, but let me
There's been a massive explosion in this number.
Oh, let me take you to Blackpool. I mean, Blackpool, 25% of the population of Blackpool
It's a shocking
is on benefits.
place.
At the same time, for every single person on benefits in Blackpool, there are 2 jobs going in the hospitality industry. I can still remember somebody coming to my surgery in the Greenford Hall once and saying that they were on benefits because they had suffered from chronic agoraphobia and they couldn't leave the house. And I said, well, actually, you've just come to the Greenford. Oh, well, that's different. I've come to see you. And, but the difficult thing is a very, very hard one to grasp, is to actually separate out those people who are, in your word, Kelvin, malingering, and there are some who do it, but also a number of people who have invisible disabilities.
But why has the malingering exploded since
the pandemic?
COVID, since the pandemic. What is causing that?
Because we signed off every single request, and all the tests that had been introduced...
Which you can't go back on.
...were essentially overridden. So from 2010, quite strict tests were introduced to try and encourage people to go back to work. And it worked really remarkably well. And the appeals worked, and I found, as constituents MP, sometimes terrible blunders were made. But on the terrible blunders, whenever I got involved, they were put right. And that seemed to me to be really important. All systems make mistakes. But the general push to ensure that people could do all the work they could do, physically or mentally, was the right push to have, and actually good for the people who are being encouraged to work.
Isn't this, I mean, I like you, I used to do those fitness to work tests, and people used to come to my surgery morning, noon and night. And the things like, can you boil a kettle, can you get out of bed? And the real difficulty, I think, here is it's impossible to actually, when somebody says, that they are suffering from some sort of mental illness, it's incredibly difficult to actually... But look, I think one of the key things, one of the things...
So what would you do about that, though?
Well, I'm just about to say, give credit to the Conservative government. What they're actually saying is, let's use this working from home explosion and stuff, and actually you make some of these people who actually give them jobs to work from home, because is it not better to be working from home than to be working at home on the dole? Surely that's better.
Well, possibly, except I think part of the mental health crisis is working from home and not being part of the community and talking and interacting with people.
I thought that was a preposterous solution. The idea that you've got anxiety and you're in your house all day going like that and not meeting people. Actually, they have the complete opposite view, by the way, for children. They're saying children who've got anxiety should go to school.
Well, and indeed, that's Chris Whitty who has said that.
Yeah. But when we had the debate on Ian Duncan's fist fight, I remember that one of the debates in the House said, we've got to have a combination of stick and carrot. And somebody on your side said, what we really want is a carrot-shaped stick. And it's, I think there has to be an element, if not coercion, but certainly actually discipline in the way that it is reviewed. At the moment, I think it's not even every year when people actually reassess their benefits, but it does need to be reassessed. But at the moment, if you actually look at the statistics, there comes a stage where benefit payments overtake GDP.
Our country has as little productivity, obviously, is not working. We aren't generating wealth, and yet our benefits bill is going through the roof.
We're not making anything in this country.
So one of our issues is we have to solve this. Surely one of the reasons we say, actually, I'm very sorry, we are now cutting your benefits bill by 30%. We're just going to do it and then see what happens. Because honestly, the reverse, which is when you have intellects all saying, no, you can't do this because of that, nothing will happen. That number grows. I guarantee to you, when your lot are in power, that number, which is 5 million now, will be 7.5 million by the time
we were
it
in
gets
power in
strung out.
1931 when we introduced the means test, and you remember what happened then. But
well, benefits were cut then.
Yeah,
by
it's
10%.
very much
There was
so.
an
Philip
actual
Snowden
cash.
was Chancellor of the Exchequer. I mean, I wasn't around in 1931, but I've read about it.
OK, well, thank you very much to my brilliant panel. That's all from me. Up next, it's our in-house professor, Professor Daniel Wootton. Dan, what's coming up on your programme this evening?
Oh, we've got a great lineup today, Jacob. Lee Anderson, the Conservative Party Deputy Chairman, as you know, very angry about the prospect of Angela Rayner as Deputy Prime Minister, so he's going to let loose on that. We also have Angela Levin. On the breaking news, have you heard this? Donald Trump has challenged Meghan Markle to a televised debate in the US.
Well, that sounds great fun, and Lee Anderson angry will be punchy stuff. That's all coming up after the weather. I'll be back tomorrow at 8 o'clock. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. This has been State of the Nation, and it's over 85 degrees in Somerset tomorrow.
That warm feeling inside. From Boxed Boilers. Proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello again, it's Aidan McGivern here from the Met Office with the GB News forecast. A warm, sultry night to come for many of us. More hot sunshine into Thursday. A small chance of thunderstorms developing towards western and southwestern areas in particular as low pressure sends heat and humidity northwards across the UK. Now, any thunderstorms that do develop will be very hit and miss, quite isolated, mostly towards western areas overnight. But there is the chance that these thunderstorms will contain frequent flashes of lightning, so they could be quite visible in the night sky where they do occur. Some low cloud creeping into the east. It's a warm night for many, mid to high teens, and in some places no colder than 20 or 21 Celsius. So some patchy fog about first thing Thursday, some of this misty low cloud in the east, but that will tend to retreat to North Sea coasts. And for many, it's a fine day, but we've still got that potential thundery activity moving north into Northern Ireland and parts of Scotland by the afternoon. It's a very warm or hot day in places, 29 to 32 Celsius in the south, 28 Celsius for northern Scotland. So the heat is extensive across the UK, and it's a warm start to Friday. Again, some of that misty low cloud in the east. Again, the threat of thundery showers towards the west and southwest, but otherwise it's just a case of sunny skies, and the temperatures continue to rise up to 33 Celsius in places by Saturday.
That warm feeling inside. From Boxed Boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
The Live Desk with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Pip Thompson. It's here Monday to Friday on GB News.
From midday, we'll bring you the news as it breaks, whenever it's happening and wherever it's happening, from across the UK and around the world.
Refreshing, feisty, but with a bit of fun too.
If it matters to you, we'll have it covered on TV, radio and online.
Join the Live Desk on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you